do have a distinguished panel, a wide variety of expertise, international experience, policy, published works, advocation, governmental bodies, and everything else. So I will introduce each one individually with a brief bio. We have some topics that we will hand over to the panel too. Towards the end of the session, we'll make it as interactive as possible in terms of your questions. We will do that. But further without ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dani Gordon, double certified US Canadian doctor, writer, speaker, published author, a leading specialist in clinical cannabis medicine. Her areas of specialization include integrative medicine, clinical cannabis medicine. She's a regular contributor to the Fast Company magazine and has also been featured in Forbes, Glamour, the Telegraph, and many more. Moving on to Professor Barnes, is a neurologist and has been working in the cannabis space for many years. He produced a report on cannabis as a medicine for governmental body, the all-party parliamentary group on drug policy reform in 2016 with his daughter. This was known as the Barnes Report. Professor Barnes is also the Chief Medical Officer of the European Cannabis Holdings, which runs the medical cannabis clinics in London, Birmingham, and Manchester. Dr. Leon Barron, a general practitioner based in London with a vested interest in mental health, chronic disease, and chronic pain management. Has led an interest in medical cannabis as an alternative therapy for patients who have not found conventional therapies to be effective. He has undertaken specialist training in medical cannabis prescribing from leading physicians from Canada and who are considered global experts in their field. Lastly, by certainly no means least, Dr. Callie Seaman is a veteran of the hydroponic industry, has been passionate about medicinal cannabis, for over 20 years. First studying for a degree in biomedical sciences at Sheffield Hallam, during which she worked at GSK. She went on to complete a PhD in investigating nutrient solutions for hydroponic growth of plants. She's been involved in the development and creation of leading fertilizer brands, and in 2018 she continued at Sheffield Hallam with a postdoctorate role monitoring metal uptake into the soya crops and developing analytical techniques for the accurate measurement of these plant compounds. Okay, so we'll get started, and I think I will kick off with a hopefully not too controversial piece. You may or may not have heard around the recent NICE guidelines. So I'd like to kick off, seeing as Professor Barnes has the microphone, we'll kick off with you. Can we get your initial thoughts on the NICE guidelines, please, and what that really means?
Yes, sorry to say I think the NICE guidelines are rubbish and not really worth the paper they're written on.
Perfect.
The reason for saying that is, well, the conclusions are remarkably negative. And but take pain, for example, where in 50 jurisdictions around the world where medicinal use of cannabis is allowed, every single one of those jurisdictions allow prescription for pain. And there's a lot of evidence that for cannabis, THC cannabis particularly, it's a very good analgesic agent. The Australian government, for example, produced a very good report about that. Even our own chief medical officer originally said there was conclusive evidence of the use of pain, but for reasons best known to themselves, NICE have come out with a suggestion that it shouldn't be used for pain. There's not sufficient evidence. And I think the reason for that is they've just looked at the randomized controlled trials, basically. They're obsessed with randomized controlled, placebo-controlled studies, which do not work in cannabis medicine, for reasons we can go through at some other point. But they've ignored thousands of studies and some randomized controlled trials that confirm the efficacy of cannabis for pain. And they've made similar negative comments about epilepsy, for example. And I think the reasons, well, you could argue it could be political, I don't know, but the people they put on the panel really weren't people who knew much about cannabis, I have to say, to be blunt. I'm sorry to be blunt, but I think that's undoubtedly true. And therefore the conclusions were entirely predictable. They were a little bit more negative than I was hoping, but we all knew they'd be negative, and they have certainly fulfilled their expectation.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and I think part of the issue we see in botanical medicine, which I've been involved with the last 10 years in North America, including cannabis, is that the way of doing these RCT studies, it works well for pharmaceutical drugs. It doesn't work well for botanical medicines. And so that is part of the issue here. However, I've treated thousands of patients in Canada for chronic pain conditions successfully with cannabis medicines where nothing else really seemed to do much for them. And there are many well-done studies, and the Academy of Science in the US put out a 2017 report that was very positive for chronic pain of many different varieties in cannabis. So I think, part of the issue that Dr. Barnes just touched on as well is they chose people who have no training in botanical medicine. So I'm a conventionally trained medical doctor. Then I had to go on to do a second postdoctoral fellowship to receive my training in evidence-based botanical medicine. And botanical medicine is a science just like conventional medicine. It's not any less rigorous at that very high level. It's just very different. So, if you ask me to take a look at your car and why, I don't know, it's going to make me sound really stupid with cars, but why the muffler wasn't working, if I commented on that, why would you believe me? I know nothing about cars. So if you ask someone who's not an expert in cannabis or even botanical medicines what they think about cannabis, it's like the same thing as asking me to be a mechanic for your car. It's really quite ridiculous when you think about it.
So I'll make a little point about the NICE guidelines. I think a lot of doctors were sort of waiting for these guidelines, and obviously they're only in their draft form at the moment, but they was sort of highly anticipated what the tone would be or how liberal they might be, and actually, as Mike has touched upon, they're really quite restrictive. I think my view on it as a GP is that patients and conditions don't always fit into neat boxes and symptoms. You have to look at the person as a whole and have a slightly different approach to this type of prescribing, type of medicine. And there are things that stand out for me as well. If you look at even Sativex, for example, which is a licensed medication in the UK. It's made in the UK, primarily for spasticity, MS. Yeah, it's NICE deem it, not cost effective. So the reality is, even people with MS and spasticity who might benefit from this medication generally aren't allowed to have it prescribed. So you do start to wonder sort of what the priorities are from NICE and how we can progress collectively and actually there are more and more doctors who are now coming around to medical cannabis as a treatment option for their patients. Patients generally are very on board and they're open to perhaps trying something that might help. So personally, from my view as a prescriber and a practicing GP, I think that generally it's pretty disappointing.
Anything to add, Callie?
Yes, very disappointing to actually read the NICE guidelines, but I think it's a lot to do with the fear and the lack of understanding, and they want the education first before being able to believe in this plant and know how to actually dose the plant correctly and know what they're actually prescribing is safe to prescribe as well, because as soon as they admit that cannabis is good for all of these ailments, it opens up the black market to be able to sell to anyone. So I think there's a lot of fear there that needs putting to rest before they can actually go forwards with actually recommending this.
Okay, thank you. Just to touch on that and to talk with Leon earlier about what you can and can't say, what you can and can't recommend based in your country or local restrictions. Are you finding a conflict of interest with what you think is potentially best in terms of some treatment, some management, a cure, what your personal opinion says and what you're professionally allowed to say? How does that sit with you guys?
I think I'm allowed to say anything I like professionally, aren't I? And I hopefully just tell the truth of.
Right.
There are certain medical indications that are clear and absolute and conclusive evidence, and there are other medical indications for which we need more evidence. And I'm nowhere saying that we've finished with cannabis research. We'll never finish with cannabis research. There are some things that are widely used for. Depression is probably the key one. I think that's the second largest so far illicit medical usage. But the evidence, hard evidence for antidepressant properties is pretty thin and far between. It doesn't mean it doesn't work for depression. Presumably a lot of people are using it. It does work. We just need more studies. But I don't find any restriction on me saying what I like, and I'll just try and tell the truth of as I perceive it. And I think if there's not enough evidence for X, Y, and Z, I'll say so. And if there is, I'll equally say so.
Okay.
But I don't think people shouldn't forget that doctors can now prescribe for any condition. The press keep getting that wrong. We're not just allowed to prescribe for pain or epilepsy or nausea and vomiting. It's any condition at all that is right for that person. And the threshold for prescribing will change according to what that person wants and what they've already tried. So I don't have any problem about speaking out with what I perceive as the good parts of cannabis prescription and the less good parts.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have a view?
Yeah, I've had a similar experience in Canada, because in Canada we can prescribe for any indication. But for example, when I first started prescribing cannabis and adding it to the other medications, both drug and herbal medicine that I was using already, I had a lot of people referred to me for depression, and there wasn't any published research. This was, 5 years ago. There's been a little bit since then, but not much. But here's the thing, I tell my patients that it's not a first-line therapy or a second-line therapy for depression, because we don't have that evidence. But in Canada especially, it's within their right to say, I don't care, I've already tried those other medications, or I don't want to try them, I want to try cannabis. And I found great success treating depression and anxiety, which often coexist together with cannabis, but it has to be the right product, the right strain, and it's an educated guessing game. So it's a partnership with patients, because there's also been many cases where high THC cannabis with the wrong strain can make depression worse. So I think it's a complicated topic, but I think it is possible to prescribe for these less evidence-based indications, as long as we're honest with our patients about what we know so far, and you partner with your patient. And I have found that to be very successful. I've not had the college come after me yet for anything I've done, so hopefully that will continue.
So I have a lot of patients that many don't even realise I have an interest in medical cannabis, but I just see them on my NHS surgery. And more and more patients are now asking about cannabis and CBD. So I do try and sort of separate the medical cannabis side with the CBD world, the wellness world. But it's a slightly the conversation around the CBD products can be a little bit tricky at times, because we're sort of not, as I'm sure you know, we're not supposed to endorse products or claim medical benefits, but patients are very switched on, and people read newspapers and forums and things. So I tend to say to people that CBD is a safe product. It's a safe compound. We're getting more and more evidence, and by all means, if you wish to try that for XYZ, we know that it could potentially interact with this medication that you're taking, but as long as you're informed of those things, or you read up and you know a bit more about the product you're taking, then you try it, So, but the medical cannabis prescribing of medical cannabis is still in its very early days here. So for most people, it's actually it's not a reality at the moment. But hopefully, in time, that will become more widely prescribed, and we'll have more physicians and clinics that can see the patients that are going to benefit.
Okay, thank you. Anything to add, Callie, or can we?
Well, one of the questions is mainly, should I grow my own? And that's such a difficult question to answer, because yes, it is a lot cheaper for them to grow, so it's more cost effective, but for me to say, yes, grow your own, I'm encouraging them to be a criminal. So that is a very, very difficult angle to come from. And making sure that they've got a product that they know that they are self-prescribing, and understanding what they're self-prescribing. Again, that throws up all sorts of problems that could have interactions with our medication that they've got that are already they are on, that they don't understand how that will affect them. So there are so many questions that, not being a prescribing doctor, that the physicians here get, and I get myself, and have to sort of say, I can't recommend that you do anything and do your own research. It's so sort of difficult when you know the real benefits of this plant.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to hand over to the audience for 10 minutes to fire some questions at you guys, if that's okay. Can I just take this, please? Okay, does anyone have any questions for the panel? Yes, sir.
Hello, yes. I will posit a theory that I'd like you either to knock down or support, as it were. The campaign for access to cannabis as medicine started back as a bit of a hippie thing, and the campaign has grown up, and some of us have grown up with it, and we've got more serious, and we've got into science, and we discovered science discovered the endocannabinoid system, and now finally we've made that fantastic breakthrough and got it into the sphere of what appears to be legitimate medicine. But I believe that it's not so much a pharmaceutical company conspiracy theory, which has been the big argument in the years gone past. I believe it's a problem with doctors, and obviously I exclude you four good people from this criticism, but I think they are threatened by cannabis. They're threatened by the new approach it requires to healthcare. So I'm regressing. I'm going backwards, having been through this long period where it all started off as being a bit of a hippie. I think that the only way we're actually going to get cannabis to the people who need it is through full legalization. We will make progress through the medical system. There will be a system of trials and a system of regulation that eventually allows us to make some progress, but the only way we will really make the breakthrough and get it out to the people who need it is by full legalization.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll tackle the first part about the doctors, because this is something, because I do integrative medicine, which is basically evidence-based natural medicine plus conventional medicine, I get a lot of patients referred to me who are very angry and very disappointed with the medical system. Most of my patients have been failed quite terribly by the medical system when they come to see me. So I think part of the issue we're seeing around cannabis, but not just cannabis, chronic disease management in general, is a failure of the Western medicine only pills-based approaches to improve quality of life in incurable conditions. So I think that the problem is not the doctors, I think it's the whole system. You know, we never get taught about the endocannabinoid system in medical school. We get exactly 2 hours of nutritional training. I've trained for 12 years with all my qualifications. I got 2 hours of nutritional training in my conventional training. I had to take years of that afterwards. So the problem is endemic, and most doctors I know, honestly, I can honestly say this, they really want to help their patients, and they are burned out, they're frustrated because they're receiving the backlash of the system not working. So I think doctors need to be educated. It needs to start in medical school. It needs to be on a systemic level. And I think that from that point of view, I think that's one way to tackle it. And the other thing is that conventional medicine doctors may not be the best people, may never be experts in botanical medicine. We might have to really branch out, like I'm a big fan of bringing in nurse practitioners, allied health workers who can specialize in these niche areas of chronic disease and evidence-based natural medicine, because doctors have to learn so much now that maybe they're not the only answer, you know? So those are just some of my thoughts. It's a very good question.
Okay.
Me? Okay. I think you're totally right, Peter. We now have a reasonably good legal framework in this country. It's really quite liberal. And I don't think the government is any longer at fault. There are things the government can do to tweak the system, to make a better supply chain, to make it a little less bureaucratic. But it's the medical profession that are holding things back. Now, part of that will break down over time as we begin to educate the profession, and the old guard move on. I mean, if you ask doctors, about 87%, I think was the latest survey, of doctors were in favor of medical cannabis prescription. You translate that, that's great. Will you prescribe it? And that 87% drops to approximately 0.05%, because there's only 3 doctors in this country who have so far prescribed cannabis, even in the private sector. So it is the medical profession that's holding it back. That will break down. In all countries where it's been introduced, it's taken several years for the medical profession to catch up with the reality. And I'm sure that will happen in this country. I'm beginning to think, though, that you're right. The only way to get it available to people more quickly is to grow your own. You get the subtlety of the plant. you get the variety you need. And I think personally, I don't know if it's the way to go for it's not the way to go for everybody. There are people who are too disabled, or they've got families that they don't want to grow, or they live in a high-rise flat, or whatever it is that stops them doing it. So it's not right for everybody, that's absolutely clear. But it's right for many people, and that would be a way, if the government relaxed those restrictions at least, we would get more cannabis to many more people than waiting for the medical profession to catch up with itself.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Any other questions? One question?
Hi there. I'm a pharmacist by trade. Been a pharmacist for 30 years, both in Canada and in the UK. One of the frustrating things I find is a lack of knowledge and the fact that cannabis or cannabinoid products have some medicinal benefit, yet we are told that there is no conclusive evidence, nothing that we can use to support the information that we provide to our to our patients. So from your experience in Canada, how have you kind of managed to get pharmacists on board and to get that profession to help disseminate the information and to, offer some advice and products that they can legitimately give to their patients?
So in Canada, I've never had a lot of interaction directly with pharmacists on the issue, because when I prescribe in Canada, it goes to the licensed producer of the cannabis of my patient's choice. So I prescribe all of the different companies in Canada. I try not to favor one. So because of that, in Canada, the pharmacists have, I think, maybe quite unfairly been cut out of some of the picture with the medical system. So I'd love for them to get more involved, especially now with legalization in Canada, because now what's happening is some of my patients, and I get phone calls in the middle of the night from my friends and family who have gone into a dispensary, and a very well-meaning teenager has told them, this is exactly what they need, and they take what they think was supposed to be a CBD oil, and they're too high to go to work, and they end up in the emergency room with heart palpitations, which generally speaking is quite non-threatening as far as medically speaking, but it's very scary. So I think if pharmacists could play a bigger role, it'd be great. In the UK, I've been more involved with pharmacists and starting to educate and reach out. And I think here in the UK, we can learn from this mistake in Canada, hopefully, and bring pharmacists into the fold a little bit sooner. So I have been involved in that education. I think it's completely paramount on both the CBD wellness side. I work on the CBD wellness side. I'm just launching actually my line this weekend with Collective Hemp. So if, on that side, come and see me after. But on both the medical side and the CBD wellness side, if you're stocking products as a pharmacist, you need to know what you can tell patients. Like, what can you tell patients about CBD wellness products? It's tricky because you can't say that they provide medical benefits, because that's actually illegal in the UK still. So it's navigating that whole system, and I think it's very important and very necessary. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Just one point on that. We've actually set up a society, the Medical Cannabis Clinician Society, and that's open to any healthcare professional. So we're hoping to bring on more pharmacists, and within the society, we're going to have case discussions and a sort of portal for evidence-based papers and publications and so on. So I think that's going to be a really important tool for clinicians and pharmacists, for prescribers and pharmacists.
Okay.
And there's also the Academy of Medical Cannabis, and there's a very good section on for pharmacists that Dani, I think, had. I wrote it actually, yeah. That Dani wrote, but it's really good. It's really it's very easy to read, but there's loads of great pieces of information there.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Hello. As a medical professionals, where do you draw the line between wellness and medicine? Because in my opinion, for example, herbal medicine that is traditional has always been, somewhere on the borderline, because it's, from one side it promotes your well-being, but at the same time it does some biological impact that can also be used for treatments.
It's a really good question, and what it comes down to is a lot of times the legal framework in whatever country we're speaking of. So botanical medicines can be used sometimes to treat disease states and sometimes for wellness purposes for more general health and well-being. So botanical medicines do have biological activity, whether you're saying it's for wellness or for treating a disease, but the biological activity is really dependent on things like dosage, the composition of the material you're using, the route of administration, that kind of thing, and the things that you combine together. So more it's about what claims you can make versus what claims you cannot make rather than the biological activity. It's a very good point. So there's so much crossover. Like I work in mental health, I treat medical patients in a medical clinic where I prescribe medical cannabis, but I also have a wellness practice where I use CBD wellness products. So it's a lot of semantics and down to the laws in the area.
Well, my view on it is that this plant's been around, for an awfully long time, and it's been used throughout civilizations, and we're trying to fit it into the way that we have learned medicine and learned how to prescribe, and that we've been trained, and that this is a new system. This is the clinical evidence-based medicine as we know it is 100 years old in some ways, the way we train and practice. So it's never going to just fit into one or the other, and it's a whole spectrum. And I guess individually, everyone tries to find their place within it or their expert angle. But ultimately, it's the same compounds, the same effects. But hope that's been trying to channel into our modern health system. So it doesn't necessarily fit perfectly into it. And I wonder whether in time there could be. It may always be slightly outside of the norm, and it could just sit in a space between sort of, NHS sort of general practice as we know it and hospital medicine, and perhaps somewhere between that and more complementary alternative types of medicines. And we may have a sub-specialty of doctors that have expert knowledge in that. And I don't think there would be anything wrong with that. I think that it could end up in that way.
Okay. One question from me, then we'll hand back over to you guys and talk about some topics that are fun and interesting and you're passionate about. I think just to touch on your point earlier, Mike, about the media, about either reinforcement of something in terms of a message, about are they challenging the status quo, are they advocating in certain areas? It's a two-pronged question. I think maybe you can give me your view, Callie, as well into this, but is there a huge difference between the US, Canada, stroke the UK, wider Europe? But more domestically, what do we feel the media are or aren't doing in terms of some form of advocacy for this type of treatment or lifestyle?
Well, from what I've seen, some of the documentaries out at the moment, there seems to be a little bit of a hate campaign going against THC at the moment. But making sure we have that balance is very important. The media is responsible for a lot of things within this country and a lot of the changes that they are sending subliminal messages through at the moment. So the difference really between the US and here as well is that the standardisation is not there yet. Within the UK, we don't really have any guidelines to what is an acceptable product. As I understand, Mike, you have to import all of the products that you actually prescribe, so we currently haven't got a domestic supply, and those guidelines are not there. So really there needs to be a centralised means of saying, well, this is what is an acceptable medicine, these are the acceptable levels of what we require, and the media needs to really communicate that so people can understand what is a good product and what isn't. There's a lot of marketing around, and I see it all around here about it's going to be the silver bullet that's going to cure everything. And you need to have a lifestyle change as well. You can't just expect to take a pill and you'll wake up tomorrow with this new lease of life. It isn't going to do that. It does have life-changing effects, but it's not going to do it alone. You need to do more exercise. And speaking to Dani at previous conferences, she doesn't just recommend, here you are, X amount of pills, take these twice a day. It isn't going to do that, and I think that really needs to be communicated to the masses, that you need to look at your whole lifestyle, including diet, exercise, mental well-being as well, because that has such an impact.
I think that's exactly right. And even what we eat, the fatty acid composition of our food, it actually affects how our natural cannabinoid system works in our bodies. So it starts with, it's more about than just taking anything, one single supplement, and hoping that your life is going to miraculously change. I think it's a good catalyst for some of these lifestyle changes. One of the interesting things I saw when I first started prescribing cannabis medicine was I had patients with terrible chronic pain and depression and anxiety, and some of them were not able to engage in things like meditation or cognitive behavioral therapy or lifestyle change or exercise because they were in too much mental, physical, or both pain. And cannabis gave them the relief enough to get them going. And I've also seen it help change some of their metabolic parameters, like their insulin resistance. And this is something that's just at the beginning of its infancy in the research. So it's part of the whole. I think that's really the message. I think in the media, I was just talking to the Sunday Times on the way up to this conference about a story that's going out tomorrow for them about THC vaping oils. So we have THC vaping oils that are laced with spice, which is a synthetic cannabinoid, which binds more tightly to this receptor in our brain called the CB1 receptor, and it's potentially more dangerous, way more dangerous than any THC from the plant. So there's such a diverse group of products. Hello. On the market, both on the black market and on the legal market in the CBD wellness space, that it's almost like comparing apples and oranges, and that's part of the trouble the media is having. I do a lot of commentary for the media, and it's really confusing for journalists. They're actually, most of them are trying to get it right, but the lengthy conversations and back and forth that I have with people before their stories go to print, just to help them get it right, it's and they're really worried about getting it wrong, but it's so complicated. So I think we have to help them with education. People like Callie on the on the basic science side are so important. We need to be out there educating them so they can create better media around this.
I think my perspective is overall the media has generally been pro medical cannabis cannabis. I don't know if everyone agrees with me, but and patients are pro. I found the medical establishment to be the most sort of perhaps against it, and I think when you see these articles that focus on high THC and psychosis, well, if that really is that is a real problem, and there's no question it can trigger psychotic episodes, then perhaps they need to legalise it and take it out of the hands of criminals and regulate it and produce healthy, high quality strains that we know are not going to cause problems for patients. That's a totally separate discussion, but it's a valid point because it's everywhere. Cannabis, you walk down the street and you smell it, coffee shops, and it's everywhere. So people use it, and like Dani said, there's ammonia and synthetic compounds, spice, and all kinds of nasty things. So, it's a minefield for people that are using it recreationally.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to hand back over to you guys to talk about anything that you find you're passionate about, you're fun, you feel very strongly about, or you totally disagree with. So over to you. Callie, would you like to start?
Well, I would like to see within this country like how the loop was set up so that we are not going to get, prohibition does not work. We are not going to get rid of the black market, so people are always going to grow their own. But if patients can have access to labs to know what they are actually producing, knowing what that strain, those ratios of CBD to THC, knowing that there's no mycotoxins there, knowing that they've got a safe product, that has got to be the way forward. That has got to make this all a lot safer, and people being able to report back to their own doctors as well. There are so many people out there with so much knowledge in their head that data could be recorded and could actually aid their doctors, other doctors be able to prescribe better and understand ailments so much more and the effects of medicinal cannabis on their ailments, knowing exactly what they've been consuming, knowing that terpene profile and how that affects them as well, and how some people will experience psychosis. But I think we're being treated a little bit like idiots a lot, and people need to be given the tools to be able to perform the job.
I think any topic, I think the CBD market needs to be I hesitate to use the word regulated. I hate regulations and bureaucracy. But we're in a ridiculous situation at the moment, and all those guys out there, none of them are allowed to say about the medical benefits of CBD. And there are huge medical benefits of CBD, but you can't say it. Now that is just plain stupid. Something's got to change. And what I would hate to see is it pushed down a pharmaceutical route. We shouldn't pharmaceuticalize the plant. So the last thing we want is to take the CBD off the shelves so it becomes a medicine. That would be a disaster. So I'm not in any way saying that, but we do need two things. We need better quality control, so what's on the label is actually what's in the bottle. And there's plenty of studies that show that for many people, none here today, of course, all good quality people here today, but there are those out there who what's in the bottle is crap. And that we've got to stop the crap, and we've got to allow people realistically, sensibly, to say about the medical properties of the plant. And don't go over the top. It's not a wonderful anti-aging cream that's going to take 30 years off your life. But we've got to be, well, maybe it is it? I don't know. But sorry about that. But we do need these guys out there to say about the good qualities of CBD. And also the other ridiculous thing about CBD, I can't prescribe it. I can now prescribe high THC products. I can't prescribe a simple, totally safe CBD product because I can only prescribe something that's marketed as a medicine, and by definition you can't market CBD as a medicine. So in the ridiculous situation, I can't prescribe CBD, but I can prescribe THC, and I also can't say anything about it. I do. And a lot of people, I get 4 or 5 at least people every week writing, so I want to try, I've read about CBD in a magazine, I've tried it, I've bought it from one of these excellent providers. What do I do with it now? How much dose do I give myself? Because they can't tell me. So I tell them. I mean, but it's a ridiculous situation to be in, and we do have to treat CBD and cannabis generally separate from the pharmaceutical market. We need to make our own, call it what you like the Dutch who've done an office of medicinal cannabis. I know some would argue about the medicinal label, but we need somewhere to take cannabis and treat it differently as a plant that it is, so we can market it safely and quality control it more safely. So there.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say exactly the same. The quality control is the way forward, because I get dozens, hundreds of requests on social media. How can I take CBD? Which ones are the best products? Which ones are the best brands? So we need to know what's in these products. And there was the 2017 study that I'm sure many of you probably heard about, where they looked at almost 100 products online in the US market of CBD products, and over half of them didn't have what they said they had in it, and some of them had lots of THC in it. And they were being sold as hemp-based products. So, we really need to know what we're talking about. Otherwise, it's very hard for me to give anyone advice on how to dose their CBD. And that's, I think, the way forward as well, because I also get doctors, I'm mentoring UK physicians and working with the MCCS, our nonprofit. We provide peer support for physicians, and I have doctors all the time emailing me and asking me, can I just start with hemp-based CBD with my patients? So I say, well, yeah, you can, but technically you can't, but you kind of can. So then I have to tell them how they might want to do that, although they're not really allowed to technically. So it gets very tricky and complicated. So I agree that we need more regulation, but more open-mindedness around what can be considered a medication.
I'd like to just add to the regulation side, it's not the plant that needs regulating, it's the methodology of actually testing these plants. Because the laboratories, from one laboratory to another, there is no standardized methodology. One lab will use a method such as HPLC, another will use NRM. Now these two are completely two different methods. It's kind of like comparing a kazoo to a guitar. They will both produce music, but produce very different results at the end, and very, very different quality of results at the end. So that is what needs regulating, not the actual plant itself, is the actual quality assurance and those standards putting into place so that we can trust the product and the safety of the patient is put first.
Something I feel passionately about is that I think GPs should be prescribing cannabis. We're the only doctors that have been excluded. And I don't know why that's the case. We know patients really well. We see them at home. We see their families. We see how they cope with their conditions. We see the whole picture. We see all the different medications. I actually think we also prescribe way too many medications for people, but that's a different topic for another day. And but on the positive, I've written an article with Dani on the case for cannabis in primary care, and the Royal College of General Practice the British Journal of General Practice have agreed to publish hopefully in the next month or two. So that's going to be run as an editorial, and it might just open the conversation and perhaps move the cause forwards a little bit.
Can I just back that up, that the right people, if we want people to prescribe, the right people to prescribe are the general practitioners. The specialists know an awful lot about it, very little. And you just look at what the mess they've made over the last few months, with none of them are prescribed at all, so why are we bothering? I mean, GPs are more broad-based, broad-minded, I nearly said, but broad-based, more attuned to symptom management than a specialist who's made the diagnosis in the first place and doesn't see the patient for 6 months. So why they were put in the hands of specialists only is beyond me. At least it was in somebody's hands, but it should be in the hands of GPs.
If you look to Germany, who are a couple of years ahead of us, everyone's prescribing, GPs, specialists, and patients are getting scripts, and people's lives are improving. So, you know, if they can do it well, why can't we do the same thing?
Okay, we've got 1 minute left if anyone would like to finish off.
I'll say on the topic of education, one of the comments Leon and I received on our paper when we submitted it from one of the reviewers, one of our peers, was that we shouldn't be allowed to say that cannabis has been used traditionally as a medicine. In response, which we sent them about 30 papers to the contrary. So I think we're allowed to say it now. But you know, this is where we're at. This is the amount of education we need to do with our peers. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank Dr. Gordon, Professor Barnes, Dr. Barron, and Dr. Seaman. So thank you all. Excellent, thank you.